The geopolitical landscape before the Gulf War was a complex and interwoven tapestry of historical grievances, economic ambitions, ideological divides, and shifting alliances that had been developing for decades across the Middle East and beyond, creating a volatile environment in which a spark could easily ignite a regional conflagration. To understand the roots of the Gulf crisis, it is necessary to first look at the historical and political transformations that shaped the region in the 20th century, particularly in the aftermath of World War I, when the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire left a vacuum in the Arab world that was filled by European colonial mandates, redrawn borders, and new states whose boundaries often ignored ethnic, tribal, and sectarian realities. Britain and France, as the dominant colonial powers in the Middle East, imposed artificial state systems that often pitted rival groups against each other. And these decisions planted seeds of future instability. Iraq, for example, was stitched together from three former Ottoman provinces, Basra in the Shia south, Baghdad in the Sunni center, and Mosul in the Kurdish north, resulting in a country with deep internal divisions that would become a constant source of tension and political unrest. Kuwait, on the other hand, emerged as a British protectorate with its own ruling family, the Al-Sabah dynasty, whose sovereignty was not universally accepted by its larger neighbor, Iraq, which would later claim that Kuwait was historically part of its territory, particularly the Basra Vilayet. The discovery of vast oil reserves in the Persian Gulf region in the early and mid-20th century transformed these relatively small and sparsely populated states into strategic economic hubs whose resources became the lifeblood of the global industrial economy. Oil not only brought immense wealth, but also drew intense foreign interest, especially from the United States, Britain, and later the Soviet Union, each of which sought to secure reliable access to energy supplies. This global dependency on Middle Eastern oil meant that the politics of the Gulf could never be purely local. Any disruption, whether due to war, revolution, or embargo, would send shockwaves across the world economy. By the 1970s, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, dominated by Arab producers, had gained the power to influence oil prices dramatically, as demonstrated during the 1973 oil embargo that followed the Arab-Israeli War, further cementing the Gulf region's centrality in international relations. Iraq's modern political trajectory was shaped by both its internal composition and external pressures. The overthrow of the Iraqi monarchy in the 1958 revolution brought to power a series of republican governments, some of which leaned toward Arab nationalism and pan-Arab unity, inspired by leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. This ideological current, combined with the strategic competition of the Cold War, made Iraq a significant player in the regional balance. In 1968, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party seized power in Baghdad, and within a decade, Saddam Hussein emerged as the country's dominant political figure. Charismatic, ruthless, and ambitious, Saddam envisioned Iraq not only as a regional leader but as the central power of the Arab world, capable of challenging both Western influence and rival Arab states. His authoritarian rule was characterized by a blend of modernization projects funded by oil revenues and brutal repression of political dissent, particularly among Shia clerics, Kurdish nationalists, and any perceived internal opponents. The 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran dramatically altered the strategic calculus of the Middle East. The overthrow of the Shah, a key U.S. ally, and the rise of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's theocratic regime sent shockwaves across the region, particularly alarming conservative Sunni monarchies such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, who feared the spread of revolutionary Shia ideology to their own populations. For Iraq, the revolution presented both a threat and an opportunity. Saddam Hussein feared Khomeini's potential to inspire Iraq's Shia majority against his Sunni-dominated government, but he also saw Iran's post-revolutionary chaos and purges as a chance to assert Iraqi dominance in the Gulf and to settle long-standing territorial disputes, particularly over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a crucial channel for oil exports. In 1980, Iraq launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, initiating the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal 8-year conflict that would devastate both nations. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, not only drained Iraq's financial reserves, but also reshaped the region's political alignments. Although Iraq was the aggressor, many Arab Gulf states, including Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, funneled billions of dollars in loans and aid to Baghdad, viewing Saddam as a bulwark against revolutionary Iran. The United States, officially neutral, tilted toward Iraq, providing intelligence and limited assistance, while also engaging in secret arms sales to Iran in what became the Iran-Contra scandal. The Soviet Union, too, supplied Iraq with weapons, reflecting the peculiar reality that both Cold War superpowers, for their own strategic reasons, preferred an Iraqi victory over Iran's triumph. By the war's end in 1988, Iraq was militarily exhausted but had the largest standing army in the Arab world, equipped with vast stockpiles of Soviet and Western weaponry, and Saddam was determined to rebuild his economy and assert his leadership in the post-war Gulf. However, Iraq's economic situation was dire. The war had cost an estimated $80 billion, much of it borrowed from Gulf states like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Oil prices had dropped sharply in the mid-1980s due to OPEC overproduction, slashing Iraq's revenue just when it needed funds to pay off debts and rebuild. Saddam accused Kuwait of exceeding its OPEC quota and deliberately driving down prices to weaken Iraq's economy. Moreover, Iraq claimed that Kuwait was engaging in slant drilling into the Rumaila oil field, a rich deposit that straddled their border. These disputes were layered on top of Iraq's long-standing claim that Kuwait was historically part of its territory, a claim rooted in the Ottoman administrative divisions before World War I, and revived periodically in Iraqi nationalist rhetoric. Meanwhile, the global geopolitical climate was undergoing a transformation as the Cold War neared its end. The Soviet Union was in decline, and the United States was emerging as the unrivaled superpower. With increasing confidence in projecting military force abroad, the U.S. maintained close ties with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies, ensuring the security of oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point through which a significant percentage of the world's petroleum exports passed. The Carter Doctrine of 1980 had already declared that the U.S. would use military force if necessary to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf, a stance that gained renewed relevance as instability in the region threatened global energy supplies. By 1990, Iraq's mounting grievances toward Kuwait were intertwined with Saddam Hussein's perception of himself as the leader of a strong, victorious Iraq that deserved to dictate the terms of Gulf politics. He believed that Kuwait's refusal to forgive Iraq's war debts or curb oil production was an act of betrayal, especially after Iraq had protected the smaller Gulf states from Iranian expansionism during the war. Saddam's regime began escalating its rhetoric, warning Kuwait against continuing its oil policies and hinting at the possibility of military action. Diplomatic efforts by Arab mediators and the Arab League failed to resolve the tensions, partly because Saddam underestimated the likelihood of a strong international response, and partly because Kuwait trusted in its security ties with Western powers. Thus, on the eve of the Gulf War, the geopolitical landscape was marked by overlapping tensions: Iraq's economic desperation and military strength, Kuwait's strategic vulnerability, the Arab world's post-Iran-Iraq war disunity, the West's dependence on Gulf oil, and the new strategic realities of the post-Cold War era. The regional order was fragile, and the web of historical disputes, economic rivalries, and shifting alliances meant that a bold move by one actor, particularly a leader as calculating and risk-prone as Saddam Hussein, could rapidly transform the balance of power. This volatile mix of local grievances and global interests created the conditions in which Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 would not only trigger a regional crisis but also draw in a massive international coalition, setting the stage for the Gulf War. The end of the Iran-Iraq War in August 1988 brought relief from the grueling 8-year conflict that had drained both nations of manpower, resources, and morale. But for Iraq, peace did not equate to stability. Instead, the country faced a staggering economic crisis that was arguably as threatening to its survival as the war itself. When Saddam Hussein agreed to the ceasefire mediated by the United Nations, Iraq was left with a shattered economy burdened by war debts estimated at over $80 billion, a ravaged infrastructure, and an economy that had been warped by years of militarization. The war had begun in 1980 with Iraq's relatively healthy economy buoyed by oil revenues from the 1970s boom. But over the course of 8 years, Saddam's government had transformed the state into a war machine that devoured its own reserves. Iraq had borrowed heavily, particularly from its Arab neighbors like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, who had financed Baghdad's war effort against Iran in the belief that Saddam's victory would serve as a bulwark against the spread of Iran's revolutionary Shia ideology. By the war's end, however, Iraq not only owed these nations tens of billions of dollars, but also found itself unable or unwilling to repay them, sowing the seeds of diplomatic tension that would grow into a crisis just 2 years later. Iraq's oil sector, the engine of its economy, was in a precarious state. During the war, Iranian attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf and missile strikes on Iraqi oil facilities had drastically reduced Baghdad's capacity to export petroleum. Pipelines to the Mediterranean through Syria had been shut down early in the war due to Damascus' alliance with Tehran, forcing Iraq to rely on vulnerable routes through Turkey and the Gulf. By 1988, production had improved slightly, but it was still far below pre-war levels, and prices on the global oil market had fallen compared to the highs of the 1970s. The sharp decline in oil prices in the mid-1980s from over 30 a barrel to under 15 meant that even if Iraq could pump and export more oil, its revenues were insufficient to cover the enormous costs of reconstruction, military maintenance, and debt servicing. Saddam Hussein's regime had expected that victory over Iran would bring Arab oil monarchies rushing in with grants and aid to reward Iraq for its sacrifice in containing Iran. But instead, those states began pressing for repayment. Kuwait, in particular, took a firm line, insisting that Iraq honor its obligations despite Saddam's appeals for debt forgiveness. This stance would later be portrayed by Saddam as betrayal, feeding into his growing resentment toward Kuwait's policies. The scale of Iraq's economic damage was immense. The war had cost Baghdad an estimated $450 billion in lost oil revenues, destroyed infrastructure, and military expenditures. Large sections of the country's transportation network, including bridges, roads, and railways, were in disrepair due to neglect and targeted Iranian strikes. Ports like Basra were heavily damaged, littered with wreckage from naval skirmishes. Agricultural production had collapsed, partly because so much manpower had been conscripted into the military and partly because combat had ravaged fertile areas along the Iran-Iraq border. Iraq's manufacturing sector, which had been modest but growing in the 1970s, was redirected almost entirely toward military production during the war, leaving little in the way of civilian industry to spur post-war recovery. In short, Iraq emerged from the conflict as a militarized, debt-ridden state with a fragile economic base, dependent almost entirely on oil revenues to function. The social consequences of the war compounded the economic strain. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers had been killed or wounded, and millions more had been mobilized in some form, creating a society that had been under martial discipline for nearly a decade. The state had cultivated a narrative of sacrifice and heroism to maintain morale during the war, but in peacetime, that narrative began to clash with the grim reality of shortages, unemployment, and inflation. The government continued to spend heavily on the military, not only because of lingering tensions with Iran, but also to maintain internal control. Saddam Hussein feared domestic unrest if demobilized soldiers returned home without jobs, so he kept them on the payroll or redeployed them into security forces, further straining the budget. The debt question was at the heart of Iraq's post-war economic crisis. The largest creditors, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, had collectively lent Iraq over $40 billion during the war. Saddam argued that these sums should be treated as grants rather than loans, since Iraq had fought on behalf of the Arab world. He also accused Kuwait and others of profiting from Iraq's hardship by increasing their own oil production beyond OPEC quotas, thereby driving down prices and depriving Baghdad of badly needed revenue. In Saddam's view, this overproduction was not merely an economic slight, but a strategic attack on Iraq's recovery, and his rhetoric toward Kuwait in particular became increasingly hostile by the end of 1989. At the same time, Iraq still owed billions more to non-Arab lenders, including the Soviet Union, which had supplied weapons during the war. Servicing these debts required either massive new loans or a surge in oil income, neither of which materialized in the immediate post-war years. Inflation began to erode the living standards of ordinary Iraqis. With the dinar weakening and food prices climbing, the government was forced to maintain subsidies on basic goods. But these measures only added to the budget deficit. Corruption, already endemic during the war years, worsened as officials and party elites enriched themselves through smuggling and black market deals. Reconstruction projects were often mismanaged or stalled for lack of funds. The once impressive social welfare programs of the 1970s, which had provided Iraqis with free education, healthcare, and housing, suffered deep cutbacks. This was a bitter blow for a population that had grown accustomed to state generosity in the oil boom era. Foreign investment was almost non-existent. The war had left Iraq politically isolated from much of the West, and potential investors were wary of the regime's authoritarianism and its ongoing military focus. Even within the Arab world, Saddam's relations were fraying. While Egypt sought to normalize ties and Jordan remained a loyal ally, the Gulf monarchies regarded Iraq with growing suspicion. They feared Saddam's army, still one of the largest in the region, and resented his demands for financial aid. Kuwait, in particular, became a flashpoint. In addition to the debt dispute, Iraq revived old territorial claims over Kuwait, which had been partially resolved in earlier decades but never fully abandoned. Saddam began to hint, both publicly and privately, that Kuwait's refusal to grant economic concessions could have consequences. Iraq's leadership faced an impossible balancing act. On one hand, the regime needed to maintain military readiness in case of renewed hostilities with Iran, especially as the two sides had not signed a formal peace treaty. On the other, the cost of sustaining such a large armed force was eating up resources that could have gone to reconstruction and debt repayment. Saddam chose to prioritize the military, reasoning that power and deterrence were more important than economic reform. This decision would later prove catastrophic, as it left Iraq without the means to weather future financial shocks. By 1990, the situation had reached a breaking point. Oil prices remained depressed, debt repayment demands were intensifying, and Iraq's foreign reserves were dwindling. The regime faced a stark choice: drastically cut military spending and open the economy, thereby weakening its grip on power, or find an external solution to the economic crisis. Saddam increasingly leaned toward the latter, convinced that Iraq's economic problems could be solved through coercion or even conquest. His growing fixation on Kuwait as both an economic rival and a political adversary was rooted in these post-war struggles. The narrative he began to construct of a heroic Iraq betrayed by greedy neighbors would become the justification for his most disastrous gamble. In the end, Iraq's economic struggle after the Iran-Iraq War was not merely a matter of empty coffers and unpaid bills. It was a complex web of debts, oil market dynamics, political grievances, and strategic miscalculations. The combination of an exhausted economy, uncompromising creditors, and an authoritarian leadership unwilling to compromise created a volatile situation. Rather than seek integration into the global economy or negotiate genuine debt relief, Saddam chose a path of confrontation that would, within 2 years, plunge Iraq into yet another devastating conflict, this time against a global coalition in the Gulf War. The seeds of that crisis were sown in the barren economic landscape of the late 1980s, where the echoes of the Iran-Iraq War still shaped every decision in Baghdad. In the years following the end of the Iran-Iraq War in August 1988, Iraq emerged from 8 years of exhausting conflict, battered economically, socially, and militarily. Although Saddam Hussein's regime proclaimed victory and portrayed the war as a heroic stand against revolutionary Iran, the reality was far more grim. The war had drained the nation's coffers, left hundreds of thousands dead or wounded, and destroyed much of the infrastructure and economic base that Iraq had painstakingly built in the previous decades. Against this backdrop of post-war exhaustion, Iraq began to turn its gaze toward its smaller but oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. The seeds of the eventual Gulf War were planted not in sudden hostility, but in a gradual buildup of tensions fueled by deep economic grievances, historical disputes, and Saddam Hussein's growing sense that Iraq was entitled both strategically and historically to exert dominance over Kuwait. The period from 1988 to mid-1990 witnessed a steady escalation of accusations, demands, and diplomatic sparring that would ultimately spiral into one of the most significant geopolitical crises of the late 20th century. Iraq's economic struggles were the immediate catalyst for its friction with Kuwait. The war with Iran had cost Iraq an estimated $80 billion, much of it borrowed from neighboring Arab states, most notably Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. During the conflict, Saddam had cultivated the image of Iraq as the Eastern Gate, defending the Arab world from Iranian expansionism, a narrative that persuaded Gulf monarchies to lend vast sums of money to Baghdad. Kuwait alone had extended loans totaling somewhere between 10 and 15 billion, with the implicit understanding, at least from Iraq's perspective, that these were not mere financial transactions but contributions to a collective Arab defense effort. However, in the post-war period, Kuwait expected repayment and showed little inclination to forgive the debt outright. This infuriated Saddam, who felt betrayed by what he saw as the ingratitude of a country that owed its very security to Iraqi sacrifices. The debt question was exacerbated by the global oil markets, fluctuations in the late 1980s. In the wake of the Iran-Iraq War, oil prices had fallen sharply from their early 1,980s highs for Iraq, whose war-damaged economy relied heavily on oil exports. Low prices were catastrophic. Baghdad calculated that it needed oil prices to rise to at least 25 per barrel to generate the revenue necessary to rebuild its shattered infrastructure and pay off its foreign debts. However, Kuwait, along with the United Arab Emirates, had been producing oil above the quotas set by the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. This overproduction flooded the market, driving prices down to as low as $11.14 per barrel. From Iraq's perspective, Kuwait's actions were nothing short of sabotage. Saddam publicly accused Kuwait of waging economic warfare against Iraq by deliberately undermining its ability to recover. The tension over oil production was tied to an older, simmering territorial dispute between Iraq and Kuwait. Iraq had never fully accepted Kuwait's independence in 1961, when the British withdrew from the small Gulf Sheikhdom. Although Iraq had formally recognized Kuwait's sovereignty in 1963 in exchange for financial aid, it continued to harbor ambitions toward the territory, citing historical claims that Kuwait had once been part of the Ottoman province of Basra, which in turn was incorporated into modern Iraq. These claims gained renewed prominence in 1989, 1990, 1990, as Saddam's rhetoric became more aggressive. Iraqi officials began to hint that Kuwait's borders were artificial, and that certain oil-rich areas, particularly the Rumaila oil field, which straddled the Iraq-Kuwait border, rightfully belonged to Iraq. The stage was now set for confrontation in Saddam's calculus. The combination of economic necessity, historical grievance, and perceived diplomatic impunity created an irresistible momentum toward decisive action for Kuwait. The refusal to yield was rooted in its own national pride, sovereignty, and fear that appeasement would only invite further demands. The resulting deadlock made a peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. The rising tension of 1988-1990 was thus not a single event, but a steadily tightening spiral of economic pressure, political hostility, and military posturing that would, within days of its peak, explode into the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, triggering the Gulf War. In the summer of 1990, Iraq's decision to invade Kuwait was the culmination of years of geopolitical maneuvering, deep economic distress, unresolved historical grievances, and the volatile personality of its leader, Saddam Hussein. The move was neither spontaneous nor inevitable. Rather, it arose from a convergence of circumstances that Saddam perceived as both a crisis and an opportunity. To understand the decision fully, one must examine the background factors that pushed Iraq toward this fateful act. The heavy burden of debt following the Iran-Iraq War, the contentious dispute over oil production and pricing, long-standing territorial claims, Saddam's perception of regional power dynamics, and his misreading of the likely international response. This chapter will delve deeply into each of these elements, exploring not just the practical and political motives, but also the psychological and strategic thinking that shaped Saddam's final choice to launch a full-scale invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. The Iran-Iraq War had left Iraq in a precarious financial state despite its claim of military victory. The 8-year conflict, 1980-1988, had drained Iraq's treasury, left its infrastructure in need of repair, and saddled it with an estimated $80 billion in debt, much of it owed to neighboring Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Saddam Hussein felt that Iraq's sacrifices during the war had benefited the entire Arab world by stopping the spread of Iran's revolutionary Shia Islamist ideology. In his view, the war had prevented Iran from destabilizing the Gulf monarchies and protected the oil-rich region from falling under Tehran's influence. Therefore, Saddam believed that the Gulf state should forgive Iraq's war debts as a gesture of gratitude for its role as the Eastern Gate, defending Arab nationalism. However, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia did not see the debt as a symbolic obligation, but rather as a financial matter, expecting repayment. This divergence in perception would form one of the key irritants in Iraq-Kuwait relations after 1988. At the same time, the global oil market was experiencing turbulence. In 1989 and 1990, Kuwait exceeded the production quotas set by the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Iraq accused Kuwait of deliberately overproducing oil, which lowered prices on the global market and slashed Iraq's revenues desperately needed to service its debts and rebuild. From Iraq's perspective, this was more than an economic dispute. It was a direct attack on its national recovery. Saddam's regime claimed that Kuwait's actions were part of a conspiracy to weaken Iraq economically. Perhaps under the influence of Western powers, Baghdad demanded that Kuwait reduce its oil output to adhere to OPEC quotas and compensate Iraq for the billions of dollars it claimed to have lost due to depress prices. The situation was further complicated by a simmering territorial dispute over the Rumaila oil field, which straddled the Iraq-Kuwait border. Iraq alleged that Kuwait was engaging in slant drilling, extracting oil from beneath Iraqi territory through advanced drilling techniques. Baghdad insisted that this amounted to theft of Iraqi resources. These accusations provided Saddam with a tangible grievance that he could present to both domestic and regional audiences to justify a hardline stance. Beyond economics and territory, Saddam's ambitions as a regional power broker played a decisive role. He envisioned Iraq as the natural leader of the Arab world, a position that required both political dominance and economic leverage, particularly through control of oil. Kuwait, small in size, but rich in oil reserves and financial resources, was a tempting target. Incorporating Kuwait into Iraq would not only solve Saddam's financial woes by erasing debt and boosting oil reserves, but also give him control of more than 20% of the world's proven oil reserves. This would dramatically increase Iraq's influence within OPEC and enhance its bargaining power on the global stage. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the tensions in mid-1990 proved fruitless. In July, Nebraska negotiations between Iraq and Kuwait, brokered in part by Saudi Arabia, failed to yield an agreement. Saddam escalated his rhetoric, accusing Kuwait of waging economic warfare against Iraq. His tone in speeches and in meetings with Arab leaders grew increasingly confrontational, portraying Iraq as the victim of conspiracies by neighbors who had benefited from its sacrifices in the war with Iran, but now sought to undermine it. A pivotal moment came during Saddam's meeting with April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, on July 25, 1990. Saddam outlined Iraq's grievances against Kuwait in detail, while Glaspie reportedly indicated that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab disputes, a statement later interpreted controversially as a sign that Washington would not intervene militarily if Iraq moved against Kuwait. Whether this was a diplomatic miscalculation, a misunderstanding, or deliberate ambiguity remains debated. But to Saddam, it likely reinforced his belief that an invasion would not provoke a direct U.S. military response. In the days that followed, Iraqi troop movements toward the Kuwaiti border accelerated. By late July, over 100,000 Iraqi soldiers were deployed near the frontier, supported by hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles. While Kuwait continued to believe that the crisis could be resolved diplomatically, Saddam's mind was turning toward decisive action. Iraqi state media intensified anti-Kuwaiti propaganda, portraying the emirate as corrupt, ungrateful, and in league with foreign powers to weaken Iraq. Saddam's final decision to invade was driven by a combination of misjudged calculations. He overestimated Iraq's military invincibility after the Iran-Iraq War, underestimated the resolve of the international community, and assumed that the swift occupation of Kuwait would be met with minimal resistance and quick acceptance. He likely believed that once Iraqi forces controlled Kuwait, the world would eventually normalize relations and accept the new reality, as had often happened with territorial disputes in the past. Thus, in the early hours of August 2nd, 1990, Iraq launched a massive invasion of Kuwait. The operation, swift and overwhelming, saw Kuwait City captured within hours. Saddam declared Kuwait to be Iraq's 19th province, believing that the gamble had paid off. Yet, this decision would prove catastrophic, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to the Gulf War, the destruction of much of Iraq's military capability, and the beginning of a long period of isolation and hardship for the Iraqi people. The decision to invade was not a singular moment of madness, but the endpoint of a logical, if deeply flawed, chain of reasoning shaped by economic desperation, nationalist ambition, personal hubris, and misreading of international politics. Saddam's choice would alter the trajectory of the Middle East for decades, drawing global attention and military power into the region in ways unseen since the colonial era. The invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, marked one of the most dramatic and consequential turning points in the modern history of the Middle East, igniting a chain of events that would lead to the Gulf War. At dawn, Iraqi forces under the command of President Saddam Hussein launched a rapid and overwhelming military assault on the small, but strategically and economically. vital nation of Kuwait. The operation was swift, meticulously coordinated, and overwhelming in its scale compared to Kuwait's modest defense capabilities. Iraqi armored divisions, backed by elite Republican Guard units, crossed the border in the early hours, supported by artillery barrages, helicopter gunships, and airstrikes targeting Kuwaiti military installations, communication centers, and government buildings. Within just a few hours, Kuwait's small defense forces, though spirited in their resistance, were outmatched both in numbers and in firepower. Many Kuwaiti soldiers fought valiantly, particularly in locations such as the Al-Jarrah defensive line, but the sheer momentum of Iraq's offensive left them with little chance of holding the capital. By mid-morning, Iraqi troops had entered Kuwait City, securing key infrastructure, seizing the royal palace, and forcing the Kuwaiti ruling family, including Emir Sheikh Jaber al-Ahmad al-Sabah, to flee into exile in Saudi Arabia. The invasion was not a spontaneous act of aggression, but the culmination of a period of escalating tensions between Iraq and Kuwait over oil pricing, debt repayment, and alleged Kuwaiti overproduction of crude oil, which Baghdad claimed was a deliberate attempt to weaken Iraq's fragile post-Iran-Iraq war economy. Saddam Hussein framed the invasion as both an act of economic justice and a reclamation of what he asserted was historically Iraqi territory, harking back to the early 20th century, when Kuwait's borders were drawn under British colonial influence. In his rhetoric, Saddam sought to cast the move as a liberation rather than an occupation, portraying himself as the champion of Arab nationalism resisting Western interference. However, this narrative failed to mask the stark reality: Iraq's occupation was a direct violation of Kuwait's sovereignty and a breach of international law. The Iraqi leadership moved quickly to consolidate control, replacing Kuwait's government institutions with Iraqi administrators, imposing military rule, and installing a puppet regime that declared the annexation of Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province on the ground. The occupation had an immediate and chilling impact on Kuwaiti society. Iraqi troops conducted mass arrests of individuals suspected of resisting the occupation, and reports soon emerged of human rights abuses, including executions, torture, and the looting of businesses and homes. Banks were emptied, museums and cultural institutions were stripped of valuable artifacts, and oil facilities were placed under Iraqi control, giving Baghdad command over approximately 20% of the world's proven oil reserves. Kuwaiti civilians, shocked by the sudden loss of their nation's independence, either fled to neighboring countries or began to organize underground resistance movements. Small groups of Kuwaiti patriots, operating covertly, carried out acts of sabotage against Iraqi forces, gathering intelligence for the coalition that would later form to oppose the invasion. Despite the risks, these resistance networks played a critical role in maintaining national morale and challenging Iraqi authority. Even as the occupation tightened, internationally, the invasion was met with swift condemnation. Within hours, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session and passed Resolution 660, demanding Iraq's immediate withdrawal from Kuwait. The Arab League was thrown into crisis, as some member states, particularly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, viewed Saddam's actions as a direct threat to regional stability, while a few others hesitated, wary of Western military involvement in Arab affairs. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, recognized the invasion as a destabilizing move with potentially catastrophic consequences for the global oil market and for the post-Cold War international order. Bush quickly declared that the aggression would not stand and began organizing a broad international coalition to pressure Iraq into retreat, setting the stage for what would become Operation Desert Shield. The speed and decisiveness of Iraq's military success in the initial invasion were matched only by the equally rapid diplomatic and military mobilization. Against it, Saddam Hussein had miscalculated in believing that the international community, fractured in the wake of the Cold War and often divided over Middle Eastern politics, would not unite against him. Instead, the invasion of Kuwait served as a rallying point for an unprecedented coalition of nations, including both Western powers and Arab states, determined to reverse the annexation by force if necessary, as Iraqi forces dug in to defend their newly claimed territory, and as the Kuwaiti government in exile pleaded for international intervention. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the political map of the Gulf region and leave an enduring legacy on global geopolitics. Diplomats at the United Nations to craft a collective response. This emerging U.S.-Soviet alignment was a crucial factor that allowed the Security Council to act decisively without the familiar paralysis of veto-based deadlock. The broader geopolitical significance of this moment was not lost on observers. For the first time since the founding of the UN in 1945, The Council's most powerful members were in broad agreement about confronting a major act of aggression. Within hours of the invasion, the United Nations Security Council convened in an emergency session on August 2nd, 1990, the same day Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait. The Council adopted Resolution 660, demanding Iraq's immediate and unconditional withdrawal. The resolution was passed with 14 votes in favor and only Yemen abstaining, signaling overwhelming global condemnation. This was just the first in a rapid sequence of resolutions that would escalate from diplomatic pressure to the authorization of force over the following months. The speed and clarity of the Security Council's actions were extraordinary compared to previous conflicts, underscoring the gravity of the situation and the unity among major powers. In the Arab world, the reaction was more complex. The Arab League faced one of the most severe tests in its history. Some member states, particularly Egypt under President Hosni Mubarak and Saudi Arabia, saw Iraq's invasion as a direct violation of Arab solidarity and sovereignty. Mubarak, in particular, worked tirelessly to mediate in the initial days, shuttling between Baghdad and other capitals to seek a negotiated withdrawal. However, other Arab states such as Jordan, Yemen, and the Palestine Liberation Organization (APL) adopted a more sympathetic or at least non-confrontational stance toward Iraq, driven by a combination of political alliances, economic dependence, and popular sentiment in their streets. This division within the Arab League was mirrored by public opinion across the region, where many ordinary Arabs, though disapproving of the invasion, viewed Saddam Hussein as a defiant figure challenging Western dominance in the Middle East. International outrage quickly translated into concrete economic measures. Within days, the United States and its allies began freezing Iraqi and Kuwaiti assets under Baghdad's control, halting all trade with Iraq, and imposing unilateral sanctions. Japan, which imported significant amounts of oil from the Gulf, took the unprecedented step of joining these sanctions despite its post-war pacifist constitution. The EC followed suit, implementing a complete trade embargo. On August 6th, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 661, which imposed comprehensive economic sanctions on Iraq, prohibiting all imports and exports except for medical supplies and, in humanitarian cases, foodstuffs. This resolution was binding on all UN member states, marking a rare instance where the Council moved beyond condemnation to enforce mandatory measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. The sanctions were intended to pressure Saddam Hussein into withdrawing from Kuwait without the need for military confrontation. However, Iraqi leadership dismissed these moves as tools of Western imperialism. Saddam calculated that the world's dependence on Gulf oil, combined with divisions among Arab states and the potential reluctance of the Soviet Union to fully align with Washington, would limit the effectiveness of the embargo and eventually force a diplomatic compromise favorable to Baghdad. This miscalculation would become one of the defining errors of his regime during the crisis. As August progressed, the tone of the international response grew more determined. The United States began deploying troops to Saudi Arabia under Operation Desert Shield to deter further Iraqi advances. This move, announced on August 7th, was undertaken at the request of King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who feared that his kingdom could be the next target. The arrival of U.S. forces in the Arabian Peninsula was historically significant, marking the first time American combat troops were stationed in large numbers on Saudi soil. The deployment was soon joined by forces from Britain, France, Canada, Australia, and other allies, signaling the emergence of a broad coalition. At the United Nations, diplomatic activity intensified. Resolutions continued to pile up, each tightening the noose around Iraq. Resolution 662, August 9th, declared Iraq's annexation of Kuwait null and void, and demanded that no member state recognize it. Resolution 664, August 18th, demanded the release of foreign nationals trapped in Iraq and Kuwait, many of whom were effectively being used as human shields by Saddam regime. These measures were complemented by naval blockades enforced in the Gulf to intercept ships violating sanctions, with multinational naval forces patrolling the region. In capitals around the world, the outrage at Iraq's defiance of the UN's demands was amplified by media coverage of the invasion's aftermath. The plight of Kuwaiti civilians under occupation, reports of looting, human rights abuses, and the systematic dismantling of Kuwait's economy. Western governments leveraged these reports to rally public opinion behind stronger measures. In Washington, President Bush began articulating a doctrine that linked Iraq's aggression to the need for a new world order in which international law would be respected and collective security upheld. This framing resonated not only with traditional allies, but also with countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that had themselves been victims of foreign aggression in the past. By the end of August 1990, it was evident that the UN's initial diplomatic approach, though swift and coordinated, was unlikely to produce an Iraqi withdrawal on its own. The sanctions regime was in place, but Saddam showed no sign of compromise, instead entrenching his forces in Kuwait and integrating the territory administratively into Iraq. As weeks turned into months, the conversation in the Security Council and in Western capitals began shifting from sanctions as the sole tool to the possible use of military force authorized by the UN. This evolution in thinking would culminate later in the year with Resolution 678. But in these early months, the sheer scale of the international outrage and the unprecedented unity of the Security Council stood out as historic. The task of building the multinational coalition that would eventually confront Iraq in the Gulf War was one of the most intricate feats of diplomacy and strategic coordination in modern history. It unfolded in the shadow of Iraq's August 2nd, 1990 invasion of Kuwait, an event that shocked the world but did not automatically guarantee a united response. While the initial condemnation was widespread, transforming outrage into a functional, militarily capable alliance required meticulous effort by the United States and its partners. At the center of this effort was U.S. President George H.W. Bush, whose political instincts, diplomatic skill, and personal rapport with other world leaders proved decisive. He understood that a successful response to Saddam Hussein's aggression had to be more than an American-led operation with a handful of allies it needed. To embody the legitimacy of collective action, backed by the authority of the United Nations, the participation of regional Arab states, and the visible commitment of major global powers. Only such a broad-based coalition could counter Iraqi propaganda that the crisis was simply another instance of Western imperialism in the Middle East. From the first hours after the invasion, Bush and his senior advisors, most notably Secretary of State James Baker, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Colin Powell, began formulating a two-pronged approach, simultaneously prepare for a military campaign to liberate Kuwait and mount an aggressive diplomatic offensive to secure the widest possible coalition. The diplomatic front was as critical as the military one, for it would determine not only the level of political legitimacy for any intervention, but also the degree to which costs, risks, and responsibilities could be shared among participating nations. The United States knew that a unilateral war to evict Iraq would be politically explosive, economically burdensome, and militarily more difficult without regional basing rights, financial support, and shared manpower. The coalition-building process therefore began with the countries most directly threatened by Saddam's expansionism, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Egypt. Saudi Arabia was the linchpin of the coalition. Its vast oil reserves, strategic location, and role as custodian of Islam's two holiest sites meant that its decision to host foreign troops would either make or break the coalition's credibility. Initially, King Fahd was cautious, wary of the domestic and pan-Arab backlash that might result from inviting Western forces, particularly American troops, onto Saudi soil. Saddam Hussein sought to exploit this hesitation by assuring Riyadh that Iraq had no designs on Saudi territory and offering to negotiate. But U.S. intelligence assessments, backed by satellite imagery, revealed significant Iraqi troop deployments near the Saudi border. On August 6th, Cheney traveled to Saudi Arabia to personally brief King Fahd on the threat. He brought with him detailed reconnaissance photos showing armored columns poised for potential movement south. The visual evidence, combined with Saddam's refusal to withdraw from Kuwait, persuaded King Fahd that the danger was real and immediate. The very next day, August 7th, he agreed to host U.S. and Allied forces as part of what became Operation Desert Shield. This decision was a turning point in coalition building, providing the staging ground necessary for the defense of Saudi Arabia and the eventual liberation of Kuwait. With Saudi Arabia on board, the USR turned to securing the participation of other Arab states. Egypt, under President Hosni Mubarak, quickly emerged as a critical partner. Mubarak had personally attempted to mediate in the early days of the crisis, flying to Baghdad in a last-ditch effort to convince Saddam to withdraw. When this failed, Egypt aligned with the anti-Iraq camp, both for reasons of regional stability and to maintain its close strategic relationship with the United States. Egypt's participation carried symbolic weight. It was the most populous Arab nation, a leader in the Arab League, and a country with a long history of military involvement in regional affairs in return for Egypt's commitment. The United States, along with Gulf states, promised significant debt relief and financial assistance, easing Cairo's crushing economic burdens. Syria's inclusion in the coalition was perhaps the most surprising diplomatic coup. Historically, Syria under President Hafez al-Assad had been an adversary of both the United States and many Gulf monarchies. Damascus had aligned with the Soviet Union during the Cold War and had tense relations with Baghdad, stemming from ideological and personal rivalries between the Syrian and Iraqi branches of the Ba'ath Party. Yet these tensions with Iraq proved advantageous to the coalition. Assad saw an opportunity to weaken Saddam, improve relations with Washington, and secure Arab League legitimacy for his position. In October 1990, Syria sent a contingent of troops to join coalition forces in Saudi Arabia, a move that shocked many observers and demonstrated the extraordinary political realignment the crisis had triggered. Beyond the Arab world, the United States sought the involvement of key allies in Europe and Asia. Britain was an early and steadfast supporter, with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher urging Bush to take a hard line against Saddam and pledging British forces to the mission. France, despite its previous cordiality with Iraq, also committed troops and equipment, recognizing the broader stakes of upholding international law and maintaining Gulf stability. NATO allies such as Canada, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands contributed naval and air forces, enhancing the multinational character of the effort. Even countries with no direct strategic interest in the Gulf, such as Argentina and New Zealand, joined the coalition, signaling the global reach of the anti-Iraq consensus. One of the most notable aspects of the coalition was the participation of non-traditional partners from Asia. Japan, constrained by its post-war constitution from engaging in combat, provided substantial financial support, contributing billions of dollars to offset the costs of the operation. South Korea, seeking to strengthen ties with Washington and demonstrate its capabilities as a responsible global actor, dispatched troops and equipment. These contributions reflected not only solidarity with the United States, but also recognition of the importance of stable oil supplies to the world economy. Financing the coalition effort was a colossal undertaking. The cost of deploying and sustaining hundreds of thousands of troops, operating an armada of ships, and maintaining a massive airlift was staggering. To mitigate this burden, Washington embarked on an intensive campaign to secure financial commitments from wealthy states, particularly in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait in exile, and the United Arab Emirates provided the largest shares, covering tens of billions of dollars in expenses. Germany and Japan, while not sending combat troops, also contributed significant funds, in part to deflect criticism of checkbook diplomacy, and in part to reinforce their standing as responsible economic powers. By the time the war began, the United States had managed to offset the vast majority of its direct costs through these contributions, an achievement unparalleled in the history of modern warfare. Diplomatically, coalition building was anchored in the framework of the United Nations. The Security Council, freed from Cold War paralysis, became the arena where the legal and moral legitimacy of the coalition was established. Through a series of resolutions, beginning with Resolution 660 condemning the invasion, followed by Resolution 661 imposing sanctions, and culminating in Resolution 678 authorizing the use of all necessary means. If Iraq did not withdraw by January 15, 1991, the UN provided a mandate that coalition leaders could point to as evidence that they were acting not unilaterally but on behalf of the international community. This UN imprimatur was vital in persuading hesitant nations to participate, as it insulated them from domestic criticism and charges of serving as pawns in an American-led adventure. Building and sustaining the coalition also required constant attention to narrative and perception. Saddam Hussein sought to portray the crisis as a struggle between the Arab world and Western imperialism, framing himself as the defender of Palestine and the champion of Arab dignity. To counter this, the coalition emphasized the Arab participation in its ranks, regularly showcasing the contributions of Egyptian, Syrian, Saudi, and other Muslim-majority countries. Care was taken to present the mission as one of liberation, not occupation, and as limited to restoring Kuwaiti sovereignty rather than imposing regime change in Iraq, a point that would later shape the decision to end the war after. The liberation of Kuwait rather than push on to Baghdad. By the close of 1990, the coalition numbered over 30 nations, with forces deployed across the Gulf region and naval units patrolling its waters. This unprecedented alignment of countries from NATO members to Arab states, from Asian economic powers to smaller nations seeking a role in upholding the post-Cold War order, was a testament to the success of the diplomatic offensive. It also reflected a convergence of interests: the defense of international law, the protection of oil supplies, the deterrence of further aggression, and, for some participants, the opportunity to strengthen ties with Washington or secure economic and political concessions. The coalition's formation was not without its strains. Differences persisted over strategy, rules of engagement, and the ultimate objectives of the campaign. Some Arab states were deeply uncomfortable with the scale of Western military presence on their soil. Others worried about the potential for the conflict to spiral into a broader regional war, particularly if Israel became involved in retaliation for Iraqi provocations. Managing these concerns required deft diplomacy, continuous consultation, and a willingness by the United States to accommodate differing perspectives while keeping the coalition's core mission intact. Yet despite these challenges, the coalition held together, an achievement that would prove decisive when the January 15th deadline passed without an Iraqi withdrawal and Operation Desert Storm commenced. The groundwork laid in the second half of 1990 through tireless shuttle diplomacy, economic coordination, military planning, and political messaging ensured that the war to liberate Kuwait would be fought not by a single superpower acting alone, but by a broad and diverse array of nations united by a common cause. The coalition was both a military instrument and a political symbol, a demonstration of what could be achieved when the world's nations rallied behind the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and committed to collective security in the post-Cold War era. The launch of Operation Desert Shield on August 7, 1990, marked the decisive shift from diplomatic protest and economic sanctions to a visible, large-scale military presence in the Gulf, aimed at deterring further Iraqi aggression. Just 5 days earlier, on August 2nd, Saddam Hussein's armored columns had swept into Kuwait, seizing the tiny emirate in a matter of hours and announcing its annexation as Iraq's 19th province. The shock of that act reverberated globally, but for the United States and its key allies, the more immediate fear was that Saddam's ambitions would not stop at Kuwait's southern border. Intelligence assessments from U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, indicated that significant Iraqi forces were massing along the frontier with Saudi Arabia. The prospect of Iraqi divisions rolling into the oil-rich eastern province home to the bulk of Saudi Arabia's petroleum infrastructure and just across the Gulf from Iran was unacceptable not only for regional security but for the stability of the entire global economy. The defense of Saudi Arabia, therefore, became the first operational priority, and Desert Shield was conceived as the rapid deployment of forces to achieve that goal. President George H.W. Bush's decision to order American troops to Saudi soil was not taken lightly. The presence of large numbers of non-Muslim foreign soldiers in the kingdom carried obvious political sensitivities, particularly given Saudi Arabia's role as custodian of Mecca and Medina. Any such deployment risked inflaming public opinion across the Arab and Islamic world and could be exploited by Saddam Hussein as propaganda, casting the crisis as a Western crusade against Islam rather than a collective effort to reverse aggression. Thus, before making his move, Bush sought explicit permission from King Fahd. On August 6th, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney flew to Riyadh with General Norman Schwarzkopf, CENTCOM commander, to present the Saudi leadership with intelligence showing the scale of the threat. The reconnaissance imagery revealed armored brigades, artillery units, and logistical elements in southern Iraq, positioned within striking distance of the Saudi oil fields and key port facilities. Fahd, initially reluctant, was persuaded by the evidence and by Cheney's assurances that the deployment's sole purpose was defensive, with the king's consent secured. Bush announced the commencement of Operation Desert Shield the following day. The speed of the U.S. response was extraordinary. Within hours of the presidential order, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division began boarding transport aircraft bound for Dhahran. This rapid reaction force, light on heavy equipment but quick to deploy, served as a tripwire. Defense, its mission was not to halt a full-scale Iraqi invasion, but to signal that any attack on Saudi Arabia would bring immediate confrontation with U.S. forces. The initial deployments were soon reinforced by Marine units, mechanized brigades, and supporting air assets. Carrier battle groups moved into position in the Gulf and Red Sea, providing both air cover and strike capability if needed. By the end of August, tens of thousands of U.S. personnel were in theater, with numbers growing steadily in the following months. For CENTCOM, Desert Shield posed immense logistical challenges. The Gulf region lacked the large-scale infrastructure that might have made rapid deployment easier. Ports and airfields had to be expanded, supply lines secured, and pre-positioned equipment moved into place. The extreme heat and sand-laden winds of the desert environment tested both personnel and machinery. Every gallon of fuel, every meal, every spare part had to be shipped across thousands of miles, often through multiple transit hubs. This required a massive sea lift operation U.S. maritime administration vessels, chartered commercial ships, and military sea lift command cargo carriers transported tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, helicopters, and mountains of supplies. The scale of the effort rivaled the logistical feats of World War II's Red Ball Express or the Korean War's Incheon buildup. In parallel with the physical deployment came the careful management of coalition sensitivities. Desert Shield was not solely an American operation. From the outset, Washington sought to integrate Allied forces into the mission. British Tornado squadrons, French Jaguar aircraft, Egyptian mechanized units, and Syrian contingents began arriving in Saudi Arabia in late summer 1990, adding to the multinational character of the defense. These contributions had both practical and symbolic value. They enhanced military capability while undermining Saddam's attempts to frame the standoff as the West versus Iraq. Particularly important was the presence of Arab and Muslim majority states, forces, which reassured Saudi citizens and the broader region that this was not an occupation but a legitimate defense against aggression. The rules of engagement during Desert Shield were deliberately defensive. Coalition forces were authorized to protect Saudi territory and respond to any Iraqi incursion, but they were not to conduct offensive operations into Kuwait or Iraq. This was in line with the political strategy, to give economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure a chance to compel Saddam to withdraw without bloodshed, while maintaining a credible military deterrent should those measures fail. This dual-track approach military readiness combined with diplomatic patience reflected the thinking of Bush and his senior advisors, who recognized that premature offensive action might fracture the coalition, alienate hesitant partners, and undermine the legitimacy afforded by the United Nations, while the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines settled into their desert camps. The psychological dimension of Desert Shield unfolded. Saddam Hussein sought to turn the Arab Street against the coalition by exploiting religious and nationalist sentiment. His propaganda emphasized the presence of infidel troops in the land of the two holy mosques and linked the crisis to the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict, presenting himself as the champion of Arab resistance. State-controlled Iraqi media beamed these messages across the region, while Baghdad hosted carefully choreographed press tours showing Western hostages in supposed comfort, attempting to counter reports of brutality in occupied Kuwait. The coalition, for its part, mounted its own information campaign, highlighting Saddam's violation of Arab sovereignty, his disregard for Islamic prohibitions against aggression, and the multinational nature of the forces arrayed against him. By the autumn of 1990, Desert Shield had transformed the Gulf into one of the most heavily militarized regions on the planet. Air bases in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE bustled with activity as squadrons of fighters, bombers, tankers, and surveillance aircraft arrived. Naval task forces patrolled the Gulf and the Red Sea, enforcing UN sanctions and conducting maritime interception operations to prevent Iraq from smuggling oil or importing prohibited goods. On land, defensive positions were established along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, complete with berms, trenches, and minefields. War games and joint exercises tested interoperability among coalition partners, ironing out differences in communication systems, tactics, and command structures. Even as Desert Shield progressed, its ultimate outcome remained uncertain. The sanctions regime was in place, and diplomatic efforts, most notably at the United Nations, continued to press Iraq for compliance. Yet Saddam showed no sign of yielding. His forces dug into Kuwait, fortifying positions, laying minefields, and constructing elaborate defensive lines. Analysts debated whether sanctions alone could achieve the coalition's goals or whether a transition to offensive operations would eventually be necessary behind closed doors. U.S. military planners refined war plans that would later form the basis of Operation Desert Storm. Even as the public posture remained one of patient deterrence, Saddam Hussein's reaction to the unprecedented military, political, and economic pressure arrayed against him in the latter half of 1990 was not one of retreat, but of calculated defiance. From the moment Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait on the 2nd of August, through the buildup of coalition forces under Operation Desert Shield, and into the bitterly cold first weeks of 1991, Saddam's public and private stance was consistent. He would not withdraw. He would not bow to United Nations resolutions, and he would frame the crisis on his own terms, to the outside world, particularly to Washington, London, Paris, and Riyadh this obstinacy seemed reckless, even suicidal. Yet to Saddam, defiance was not merely a matter of personal pride. It was a deliberate political strategy rooted in his understanding of Arab politics, his reading of history, and his faith in the power of intimidation, propaganda, and endurance. In the early weeks after the invasion, Saddam's rhetoric became more bombastic, calculated to galvanize support at home and in sympathetic quarters of the Arab and Islamic world. He wrapped himself in the mantle of anti-imperialism, portraying Iraq not as an aggressor but as the vanguard of resistance against Western domination. He seized on the deep well of resentment toward the United States and its allies over decades of perceived meddling in the Middle East. From the creation of Israel in 1948 to the 1982 invasion of Lebanon and the ongoing plight of the Palestinians, in speech after speech broadcast across the region, Saddam linked his occupation of Kuwait to the broader struggle for Arab dignity and independence. Accusing the Gulf monarchies of being puppets of the West and accusing Washington of plotting to control Arab oil, this was not mere posturing for foreign audiences. It was also aimed at cementing domestic loyalty. Saddam understood that in a tightly controlled state like Iraq, the survival of the regime depended on projecting an image of strength and inevitability. To admit weakness, to hint at compromise, would be to invite doubt among his inner circle and erode the climate of fear and respect that kept him in power. The Revolutionary Command Council, the Ba'ath Party elite, the military high command all had been shaped by decades of purges, rewards, and punishments. Loyalty was maintained not only by shared ideology, but by the belief that Saddam could withstand any challenge, whether from Iran, the Kurds, the Americans, or the United Nations. The defiance was institutional as well as personal, even as the United Nations passed resolution after resolution demanding withdrawal from Kuwait. Baghdad issued its own counter-resolutions and staged elaborate rallies in support of Iraq's 19th province. Ministries churned out propaganda posters showing Saddam as a modern-day Saladin. Defending the Arab nation from crusaders, state-controlled newspapers carried editorials denouncing the illegal UN sanctions as an economic siege against the Iraqi people. Television broadcasts interspersed images of military parades with footage of destroyed Palestinian homes in the occupied territories, reinforcing Saddam's claim that the West's true agenda was to protect Israel and suppress Arab resistance. His defiance was also expressed through calculated provocations. In late August 1990, Iraqi security forces began rounding up hundreds of foreign nationals, Western expatriates, oil workers, diplomats, families, trapping them in Kuwait and Iraq. They were dispersed across military and strategic sites, effectively used as human shields. This tactic was intended to deter coalition airstrikes, to inflame public opinion in the hostages' home countries, and to demonstrate Saddam's willingness to ignore international norms. When foreign leaders pleaded for their release, Saddam staged televised meetings with small groups of hostages, sometimes patting children on the head in an attempt to present himself as magnanimous. The imagery was jarring, a dictator flanked by frightened civilians, smiling for the cameras as if hosting honored guests. Militarily, Saddam ordered the fortification of Kuwait and the Iraqi-Saudi border with a scale and intensity that stunned coalition planners. Engineers constructed multiple defensive belts, trenches filled with oil that could be set ablaze, deep minefields, anti-tank ditches, and earthen berms stretching for miles. Artillery pieces were dug in, camouflaged against satellite reconnaissance, while Scud missile launchers were dispersed to threaten both coalition forces and Israel. The message was unmistakable if the coalition came. They would pay in blood for every inch of Kuwaiti sand. This was consistent with Saddam's belief, forged during the Iran-Iraq War, that protracted conflict and high casualties could sap an opponent's will. Even if Iraq could not win in conventional terms, Saddam's confidence was bolstered by his reading of international politics. He gambled that the coalition arrayed against him was fragile, held together only by temporary outrage at his invasion. In his view, the diverse membership of Arab states, Western powers, and even former Cold War rivals would fracture under pressure, particularly if the conflict dragged on or if he could provoke Israel into entering the war. The latter goal was of particular strategic importance. Saddam knew that an Israeli military response to Iraqi missile attacks would alienate Arab coalition members, especially Syria, Egypt, and the Gulf states, possibly collapsing the alliance. Thus, the deployment of Scud missiles capable of reaching Tel Aviv was not merely a military threat, it was a political weapon. The sanctions regime imposed by the United Nations was another test of wills. By the autumn of 1990, Iraq's oil exports had been cut off, and its access to foreign currency severely curtailed, food, medicine, and spare parts became scarce. Yet Saddam used the suffering to rally nationalist sentiment. Rather than yield, he framed the shortages as evidence of Western cruelty, declaring that Iraqis would endure 1,000 years of hunger before surrendering their sovereignty. At the same time, he worked to undermine the sanctions through smuggling, covert trade with sympathetic states, and manipulation of humanitarian concerns. As Desert Shield progressed into the winter, Saddam's defiance took on a performative quality, as though he were engaged in a high-stakes chess match played before the eyes of the Arab street. He granted interviews to Western journalists, confident in his ability to dominate the narrative. In these sessions, he appeared calm, even affable, dismissing the possibility that the United States would actually launch a ground war. He cited Vietnam as proof that Americans lacked the stomach for prolonged casualties and hinted that Iraq's battle-hardened army, fresh from 8 years of war with Iran, could withstand anything the coalition might throw at it. Behind the bravado, however, there were signs of strain. Iraq's economy was in freefall, and discontent simmered among conscripts and civilians alike. Yet Saddam calculated that internal unrest could be suppressed, as it had been before, and that external pressure could be endured until divisions among his enemies emerged. His entire strategy was predicated on the belief that time was on his side, that the world would grow weary of the standoff, and that the new status quo with Kuwait absorbed into Iraq would eventually. The opening minutes of Operation Desert Storm on the night of January 17, 1991, were the culmination of months of build-up, planning, and political maneuvering. When the last hours of the United Nations' January 15th withdrawal deadline expired without so much as a hint of Iraqi compliance, President George H.W. Bush gave the order to commence offensive operations. The decision marked the transition from Operation Desert Shield, the defensive phase that had contained Saddam Hussein's forces since August 1990, to the full-scale offensive campaign designed to liberate Kuwait and neutralize Iraq's ability to wage war. For military planners, the first stage of that campaign was to be an overwhelming air assault, a meticulously orchestrated sequence of strikes aimed at blinding, crippling, and paralyzing the Iraqi military before a single coalition soldier crossed the border. The strategic concept for the air war was largely the brainchild of late Gen. Charles A. Horner, commander of U.S. and Allied air forces in the Gulf, working within the broader operational framework crafted by General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, CENTCOM's commander. From the beginning, they envisioned a campaign that was not a gradual escalation but a shock and awe opening blow. Borrowing lessons from Israel's success in the 1967 Six-Day War, NATO air doctrine, and the emerging possibilities of stealth technology, Horner's team sought to destroy Iraq's command and control networks, air defense systems, communications hubs, and leadership targets in the very first hours. Without those, Iraq's massive army in Kuwait, more than 500,000 strong, would be cut off, demoralized and far less able to resist the ground phase to come. Preparation for the air campaign had been exhaustive. For months, reconnaissance aircraft, satellites, and electronic intelligence gathering systems had mapped Iraq's military infrastructure in extraordinary detail. Target lists were refined through countless iterations, incorporating inputs from Air Force, Navy, Marine, and Allied air planners. The final plan called for more than 250 fixed targets, ranging from radar stations and airfields to Republican Guard barracks and missile launch sites. Each was assigned specific weapons, delivery platforms, and timing sequences to avoid fratricide and maximize impact. The campaign's architects divided the air war into 4 overlapping phases. The first coalition aircraft to enter Iraqi airspace on January 17th were not traditional bombers, but stealthy F-117A Nighthawks. Their angular shapes and radar-absorbing skin, rendering them nearly invisible to Iraqi radar, flying out of Al-Udeid and King Khalid air bases. They slipped undetected over the border to strike Baghdad's central communications centers, power stations, and air defense command nodes. The stealth jets were accompanied by Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from U.S. Navy ships in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, each missile following a pre-programmed terrain-hugging routing route to its target with uncanny precision. Within minutes, Baghdad's electrical grid flickered and died, radar screens went blank, and the city's anti-aircraft guns began firing wildly into the darkened sky, searching for attackers they could not see. This opening wave was followed by the roar of 15 E-Strike Eagles, Tornado GRGR, 1S from the Royal Air Force, and U.S. Navy A-6 Intruders, each assigned to destroy airfields, hardened aircraft shelters, and runways across Iraq and Kuwait. Coalition planners knew that Iraq possessed one of the largest integrated air defense networks outside the Soviet Union, with hundreds of SAM batteries, thousands of anti-aircraft guns, and a fleet of advanced Soviet-built MiG-29 and Mirage F-1 fighters. The key was to dismantle that system before it could coordinate an effective defense. Specialized aircraft such as the U.S. Air Force F-4G Wild Weasels and Navy EA-6B Prowlers flooded the skies with radar jamming signals and homed in on enemy emitters with deadly AGM-88 harm missiles, silencing Iraqi radars one by one. From the first hours, the psychological impact of the campaign was profound. For Baghdad's residents, the night sky was lit with tracers. The ground shook with distant detonations, and the sound of supersonic jets echoed over the rooftops. For Iraqi military units in the field, communications became sporadic or ceased entirely. Supply convoys were cut off, and air cover evaporated. Yet for Saddam Hussein, these were not signs of impending defeat, at least not publicly. His state-controlled television broadcast images of him walking through the streets of Baghdad in military uniform. Defiant in the face of American aggression, he promised the mother of all battles, insisting that Iraq's forces would withstand whatever the coalition threw at them. The scale of coalition air operations was unprecedented. On the first night alone, more than 1,000 sorties were flown, a tempo that would be sustained and even increased over the following weeks. By dawn on January 17th, coalition aircraft had struck targets across Iraq's breadth from the northern oil facilities at Kirkuk to the southern troop concentrations in Kuwait. The coalition's advantage in technology, training, and coordination quickly became apparent. Precision-guided munitions allowed key targets to be destroyed with minimal collateral damage, while real-time intelligence updates from E-3 AWX aircraft kept commanders aware of every shift in the aerial battlespace. While the air war's initial focus was on strategic targets, its scope rapidly expanded. Bridges and rail lines connecting Iraq to Kuwait were bombed to prevent resupply of frontline troops. Ammunition depots and petroleum storage facilities were destroyed, further degrading Iraqi operational capacity. The coalition also made a concerted effort to hunt down Iraq's mobile Scud missile launchers, whose sporadic attacks on Israel and Saudi Arabia threatened to fracture the coalition politically. This Scud hunt became one of the most frustrating tasks of the campaign, as the launchers were highly mobile, well camouflaged, and often fired at night before quickly disappearing into pre-prepared hiding spots. As the days passed, the cumulative effects of the air campaign became clear. Iraq's Air Force, despite its size, rarely challenged the coalition after the first few days, with many aircraft fleeing to Iran to avoid destruction. The once formidable air defense network lay in ruins, power generation was crippled, and Iraqi troop morale began to erode. Coalition losses, while not insignificant, were far lower than planners had feared, thanks in large part to the suppression of enemy air defenses and the overwhelming superiority of coalition pilots in air-to-air